Today is the 16th of September 2010, and this talk is going to be about the Millennium Development Goals, which are going to be reviewed at an upcoming summit next week in New York, with respect to the potential impacts of climate change on the Millennium Development Goals, and also the role of community-based adaptation. So to start with the Millennium Development Goals, these were set up in the year 2000. At the time, climate change was known about, but it wasn't really taken into account. It was only later when the third assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out in 2001, and then the fourth assessment report in 2007 alerted the development community and developing countries more generally to the fact that the impacts of climate change are likely to set back many of the Millennium Development Goals and make them unachievable by their target date of 2015 unless we took very rapid action to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. Unfortunately, under the Framework Convention, we have not achieved that reduction of greenhouse gases, so some level of impacts of climate change, particularly on poor countries, particularly on poor communities, and particularly on many of the Millennium Development Goals, are now going to set back those targets or achievement of those targets quite considerably. Now, one of the arenas that has developed as a source of marrying the top-down targets, the global targets of the Millennium Development Goals, with bottom-up approaches from communities has been community action in many different ways. Community-based development, community-based natural resource management, community-based ecosystem management, and so on. These have looked at ways of empowering the most vulnerable and poor communities and enabling them to become agents of change so that they can pull themselves out of poverty and reach their own Millennium Development Goals within the time frames that have been agreed. Climate change, as I said, is going to impact those targets and impact those communities. And in the climate change arena, there's a growing body of interest and activity on community-based adaptation to climate change, which is potentially a very interesting way forward for the global community to start thinking about in terms of looking at the combination of achieving the Millennium Development Goals in the face of adverse impacts of climate change. Community-based adaptation is a growing area of interest. Many different activities are taking place on the ground in rural and urban communities in Africa, Asia, Latin America. The community of interest have been meeting and sharing information. They've had 4 meetings over the last 5-6 years. The last one was in Tanzania in February. The next one is going to be in March in 2011 in Bangladesh, where over 200 practitioners and researchers and policymakers who are interested in community-based adaptation will come together, share their experiences, and particularly look at the theme of scaling up from the few dozens or perhaps low hundreds that we already have of pilot community-based adaptation actions to the many thousands, tens of thousands, and indeed hundreds of thousands that are going to be required over the coming decade. So the combination of community-based adaptation to climate change with community-based activities that attempt to help these communities, poor and vulnerable communities in particular, to achieve and meet the Millennium Development Goals is a growing area of further attention that particularly the global policymakers who will be meeting in New York next week should be paying greater attention to and finding ways to both find synergies between the development agenda and the climate change agenda, and also at empowering local communities, particularly the poorest and most vulnerable communities.